Welcome. Welcome once more. I'm glad you've chosen to view this presentation or listen. Some of us just like noise. Anyway, I want to talk to you a little bit about spiritualism. And I want you to know that it's more than just the messages you might receive at these spiritualist churches, which were inspired by the Fox sisters. Now, spiritualism also encompasses teachings received from spirit, better known as the séance. Now, I would like to direct your attention first to some books by spiritualists that were received from the spirit teachings. One of them is John Edmonds and George Dexter's Spiritualism, and it's a very good book. The spirit teachers are said to be Emanuel Swedenborg and Bacon. Now, I don't know which Bacon because, we think of Sir Francis Bacon, but there was also a philosopher, and I think his name was Roger Bacon. So I'm not sure which Bacon is being referred to. I also want to draw your attention to Mary Longley's teachings and emanations from the spirit world. I may have that title hosed up a little bit because it's a very long title. And that one covers the teachings that are received in part from what is said to be a child spirit. And she talks about, some of the goings on in the spirit realm. Another good one is Allan Kardec's The Spirit's Book. And that one is essentially a question and answer presentation. They are all good books. So continuing, of course, I've got my own book, which is what I'm drawing this information, some of this information from, entitled Spiritualism, Its Echoes and Foundations. And in that book, I talk about the idea of communicating with spirit, messages, oracles, prophecy, teaching, foundations, and such. I trace the practice all the way back to the early shaman, or the shaman, as I prefer to pronounce it, because I don't want them getting confused with the idea of what shamanism has become today. Today, it's more of a romanticized concept, whereas at the time, the shaman would speak to the gods, as we would put it, but they would commune with the spirits, the bodiless ones, as they were called. And through this, they would lead their clans. Now, these shaman at the time were those who were, well, today they would be considered to be schizophrenic or bipolar, manic. Another one would be, emotional problems. These were people who today would be classified as mentally disturbed. And those were the qualifications for a shaman. They would have to go through some form of mental or emotional crises. So with that in mind, now let's fast forward to the development of spiritualism, which actually took off in 1849 with the first investigation taking place on the 14th of November at the Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York. You could say that Rochester is the birthplace of spiritualism. And as I said, this was the first public seance. And that's what the messages are that you might receive in a spiritualist church. They are demonstrations of a public seance. And typically they stay right around the category of phenomenal spiritualism, meaning that you don't learn anything about life, you don't learn anything about the realm that they belong to. You don't learn anything. All you do is you get love notes, essentially, from those who have passed on. But this was something different. And I want to briefly talk to you about this investigation at the Corinthian Hall. Now, this investigation was directed by those spirits that they were communing with, and they gave a plan. One person would give a lecture, another person would do the introductions, another person would collect fees. Yes, they collected fees to attend, which, on a personal note, I find I'm in disagreement with. To me, it's something different. We'll get to that later. And they were there for 3 nights, and there were 3 committees selected to investigate them. Now, the Fox sisters were composed of Leah, Catherine, and Margaret. And if memory serves correct, Kate, or Kathleen, or Catherine, I believe. Anyway, Kate, I believe, was the youngest, and she was not there. She was not part of that investigation. Let me check my notes here real quick. Kate was, I believe, with her mother. I don't recall, but Kate was not there. The 2 sisters that were investigated were Margaret and Leah. And most people don't refer to Leah. They only know of Kate and Margaret from the Hydesville incident. So, continuing with this, there were 3 committees selected, 1 for each night, and each time the committees came back with the finding that they could not find any fraudulent acts. They could not determine how the raps or thumps, and that's how spirit communicated at that time, was through rappings and such. They could not find any way that the girls could be producing these sounds. And they stripped them down, they tied pillows on their feet. They did all sorts of things that might be considered cruel. But as I said, they could not find any fraud with them. And on the last evening, with the last report from the committee, those who were gathered became riotous, and the girls had to be snuck out. And with that was the first public seance. And that seance was the inspiration that was needed for spiritualism to begin to develop. I'm not going to talk about the messages or anything. It's the circles that are more important, because as the circles began to develop, the methodology of the seances also began to develop. They progressed from the rappings, the thumps, table tipping, the use of Ouija boards or implements similar to Ouija boards, gave way to direct contact. And what I mean by direct contact is a medium became the vessel, or the voice box, however you want to put it, became the vessel for the soul to speak through. And at that point, they began to teach. Now, a lot of the religious people will tell you that this is the devil's work and all of that is false teachings and everything. I want to bring something to your attention, because in the Gospels of the New Testament, Christ tells us that a comforter will be sent to teach us the ways of truth, or to teach truth. Now, this comforter is also known as the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit. And I want to also add that in the book of Acts, immediately or shortly following the death of Christ, this was the last part of the Passover, where all the disciples were gathered into an upper room and they were touched by the Holy Spirit and began, well, the book records, speaking in tongues. They also began prophesying and such, and witnesses there had to have been witnesses. How else could they write the book? Witnesses there state clearly that they had not had wine, which is something that was customary at that time. So today we call this channeling, spirit teachings, trance, mediumship, and the like. And as this continued, a variety of ways of holding seances, or a variety of ways of communicating with these souls, became multiple ways. I shouldn't say multiple ways, but a variety of methods, of methodologies for communicating with the souls developed. And Higginson, which is considered one of the framers, wrote that to comment on the variety of spirit communications was to comment on the variety of human temperaments, meaning that how these communications took place were individual. They were specific to the individual. Some would write, some would draw, but these communications took place. In fact, I think in Edmonds and Dexter's book entitled Spiritualism, George Dexter often wrote the teachings of the spirits that were in attendance. So conceive, if you can, what different forms of intercourse or communications took place, because these communications were suitable to the needs of the individual. And each of these individuals made their own special demand or for a particular mode of communication. And he argued that was liable to criticize all other modes if he endorsed one. In other words, he was also afraid of there being so many different methodologies that the communication itself would be rendered obsolete or void or null or dismissed. Not the case. There are a variety of books published today that are suggestive of being received through spirit or from spirit. Alice Bailey's books, very popular among the metaphysicists and such. Her books are translations from a spirit teacher. And there are a variety of other books as well. I myself, I am a spiritual leader at a church. And every fourth Sunday, I allow myself to be a vessel for a spirit to come in and teach. And these teachings are challenging or controversial, I should say, because in one instance, the teacher is saying that this whole concept of realms and dimensions and such is useless. He taught that there are not separate realms, higher realms, lower realms. There are not. It is the individual's perception that determines what these realms are. And these other worlds or dimensions and such that we speak of are merely perspectives of the individual's perception. Meditation. We go into meditation, and during these meditations, we may receive visions, such as are the writings attributed to Hermes, the Hermetic writings. Same thing. The book of Enoch speaks of traveling through a clairvoyance, focusing on a crystal. The images that are described in the book of Enoch are experiences each of us can have if we take the time to learn clairvoyance. Clairvoyance is merely another term used by spiritualists for messages. But there are a variety of ways, and there are a variety of sources that tell us of these events, these experiences. Revelations is based on such an experience. Islam is founded on a similar experience that Muhammad had in a cave. These are communications. Whether you want to attribute them solely to religious origins or not, they exist. There is a preponderance of evidence that demonstrates this that we easily write off as myths, as superstition. Even science is investigating this. Julie Bichel, associated with the IONS organization, Institute of Noetic Science, investigates this. Other scientists, such as William Crookes and Oliver Lodge, examined these events, these experiences. And I believe it was Crookes who discovered that these occurrences are specific to the individual. They discovered that conditions were needed to prepare the individual. They discovered that there were conditions that were not conducive to spirit communication. In fact, these same conditions that they determined were conducive and not conducive are listed in the Old Testament. They're commented on in the Athanasian writings of the early framers of Christianity, not going back to the development, but when Christianity became organized, they write about these things. They talk about them. So this is not something that is imaginary. Of course, you can take drugs and have a hallucination and everything, but the question becomes, is that considered a religious experience if it becomes life-changing? Because that's what these experiences do. They change your life. So I may be wandering a little bit. So let me come back to this. There are a variety of methodologies to hold a séance. It's not necessarily like you see in the Hollywood films or anything. How we do it at the church, there is a group of people who are in the congregation. We meditate beforehand. It's part of our service. We meditate, and then before going into trance or before the spirit teacher comes through, ask them if there is a question. If one of them has a question, then I allow the spirit teacher to come through, and the teacher responds to those questions, teaching them. Sometimes they're rather deep. One of the questions dealt with suicide and euthanasia, and the spirit teacher challenged us, saying that when someone takes their life, how do we know it is not their time to move from this realm into the next? They talk about a passage that we go into when this body expires and we move into what we call the spirit realm. There is this passage, and we describe this passage as a life review. Well, all of that takes place from leaving here to arriving there. That passage is that preparation from leaving one realm and entering another realm. Of course, one of the spirit teachings was that they're not different. They're essentially the same. It's a matter of perspective. Here we go again with that. Now, I'm not going to say that all of this stuff is true, because it's all relative to your thinking, to your beliefs. However, I transcribed these, and in transcribing them, they have made comments. I experienced pain in my head because I had a brainstem stroke several years ago. And the teaching spirit at that time said, oh, he's got these pains in his head because his brain is developing new pathways. It's rewiring itself. I reached a point to where the pain was getting excruciating, so I did a short cursory search. And lo and behold, the results came back that when a person experiences a stroke and the brain is repairing itself, when the new pathways cross or become too close to established pathways, what happens is a type of electrical bleed over, or the two short circuit a little bit. There's an electrical discharge. The brain, the neurons fire and they generate low frequency or low voltage well, the brain generates low voltage electricity, and that's what it is. So yes, their teachings can be relevant, but it's up to you. In all of this, the teachings from Spirit, this is not part of the phenomenal spiritualism. Phenomenal spiritualism is limited by table tipping, message work, psychometry, fluff is what I call it. You want to get into the good stuff, then you want to investigate modern spiritualism, because it is more than phenomenal spiritualism. It teaches a philosophy. It teaches how you are responsible for your own salvation, a concept that was taught by the Gnostics. Also, it teaches a philosophy that you are accountable. It teaches a philosophy that nature is the expression of God. Nature is what we call God. And if we observe nature, then the lessons that nature possesses teach us how to live a fruitful and harmonious life. Now, if you want to hold your own séance, the idea is to have a group of people together, and all of you focus on a question. All of you focus on that question. It's good to meditate beforehand. You want something that's going to be soothing, that's going to generate those alpha waves in the brain, alpha and theta waves in the brain. We listen to the chant. It's something that relaxes me, that focuses me. It grounds me in a direction. But you can select something, but the idea is to get everybody focused in the same direction. And it's best if you select one person, but if you don't, then the idea is that if you begin to hear something or sense a voice or words, thoughts, or something of that nature, then you share that. You begin to repeat that. And as you speak the words that you are impressed with speaking, and as they become to move through here and out, then your body begins to accept that spirit that is teaching. And something to keep in mind is that these teaching spirits, they are attracted to, or they speak through those vessels, those people whose thoughts resonate with them. So if you want what you might call the higher teachings, then you want somebody who is seeking these higher teachings. If you want to know about life, then you want someone who is also wanting to know about life. This is what brings you together, because these communications are based on the principle of association, meaning that birds of a feather flock together. The people you choose to hang out with are similar to you. That is what the natural principle of association is all about. You all have a common goal, and you want to be around people who have a common goal. You focus, you meditate. Sometimes you will be successful, sometimes you won't. Now, I've been investigating this stuff, spiritualism and other metaphysical and philosophical and spiritual writings for over 20 years. So when I was impressed to attempt to do that, and when I made that attempt, something happened. But that's only because I was already immersed in all of that. So that's something you have to keep in mind. And again, William Crookes, who was a well-known scientist of his day, discovered during his experiments, and he experimented with a lot of mediums, one of them being, I believe, Margaret Fox, could have been Kate. I get them confused sometimes. Another one was Dunglass. So there are, and that information you can find out there as well. But during his examinations, his studies, his experiments and such, he discovered that protocols needed to be in place, and they were according to that particular person's mode of expression, thinking, and such. And all of these methods you can read in a variety of books written by spiritualist Emma Hardinge's autobiography, also her modern spiritualism, a 20 years communication or history of communication with spirit. Leah Underhill's The Missing Link in Spiritualism, just to name a few. There is no set way. You can develop your own. And science is based on repeatability, meaning that when they conduct an experiment, every time they conduct that same experiment, they get the same or similar results. You can do that within spiritualism. Your message work, your seances, all of that can be done through following a methodology, a teaching. But keep in mind, these are all tailored to the individual. So I want to thank you for joining me with this. I hope this was valuable to you. I hope this shed some light on spiritualism in general, the seance, trance mediumship, and pick up my book. It's available at Amazon and some of the other online platforms. And within that, there are different methodologies of holding a seance that are described. And as I said before, the idea of spirit communication can be traced back to the early shaman. But if you liked this, consider subscribing. You'll get notified when something new comes out. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you again.